بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحبة السمو الشيخ حماد بن ناصر رئيس مجلس إدارة مؤسسة قطر، سعادة السيد أنطونيو غوتيريش الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، سعادة الشيخة هند بنت حمد آل ثاني نائب رئيس مجلس الإدارة والرئيس التنفيذي لمؤسسة قطر، رئيس مجلس أمناء جامعة حمد بن خليفة، أصحاب السعادة الشيوخ والوزراء وممثلي الهيئات الدبلوماسية في الدولة، السادة الأساتذة والطلاب الأعزاء، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. تتشرف جامعة حمد بن خليفة باستضافة سعادة السيد أنطونيو غوتيريش في إطار سلسلة محاضرات المدينة التعليمية لتناول قضية في غاية الأهمية في الوقت الحالي، ألا وهي أهمية التعددية في زمن التحديات غير المسبوقة، حيث تجاوزت المشكلات والتحديات الحدود السياسية والجغرافية للدول، ولم يعد من الممكن للدول أن تكون في مأمن من هذه الأزمات على الصعيد المحلي أو أن تتعامل معها بشكل منفرد. كما أن نمو التيار الشعبوي في الدول والقيادية منها بشكل خاص عمق من صعوبة هذه الأزمات وأضاف عقبات جديدة للتعامل معها. إن التغير المناخي والأمن السيبراني والاقتصاد العالمي وقضية اللاجئين والهجرة هي بعض هذه التحديات، وكل منها يتطلب تضافر الجهود الدولية والعمل المشترك نحو إيجاد الحلول ودعم تنفيذها، ناهيك عن أثر هذه المشكلات على مستقبل الشعوب والعالم بأسره. إن التعددية والاختلاف أصل ثابت منذ بداية الخلق، إذ قال تعالى: وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. لذا فإن السبيل نحو بناء عالم على أطر سليمة يقوم على التعاون والتعارف والعمل المشترك. نجتمع اليوم في رحاب مؤسسة قطر، والتي كانت نتاج رؤية صاحب السمو الأمير الوالد الشيخ حمد بن خليفة آل ثاني وصاحبة السمو الشيخ حمود بن ناصر حول أهمية التعليم في تكوين الإنسان العالمي المدرك لتحدياته المحلية والعالمية، والقادر على الحوار والعمل المشترك من أجل المساهمة في بناء المجتمع العالمي. لقد شكلت المدينة التعليمية نموذجاً للتعددية الفكرية والعرقية والدينية، يتشارك فيها الطلبة والأساتذة في العمل المشترك لمناقشة القضايا العالمية والشائكة لإنتاج قادة المستقبل الواعين لتحديات مجتمعاتهم والعالم، والقادرين على إيجاد القواسم المشتركة للعمل وتحقيق الأهداف على الرغم من جميع الاختلافات الأخرى. أصحاب السعادة الضيوف الكرام، يسرنا ويشرفنا الآن دعوة ضيفنا الكريم السيد أنطونيو غوتيريش، وهو غني عن التعريف إذ هو يشغل الآن منصب الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، وقد تولى قبيل توليه هذا المنصب العديد من المناصب المهمة. على سبيل المثال تولى السيد غوتيريش منصب مفوض الأمم المتحدة السامي لشؤون اللاجئين في الفترة بين عامين 2005 و2015، كما شغل سعادته منصب رئيس وزراء البرتغال من العام 1995 إلى العام 2002، والكثير من المناصب الأخرى. سعادة السيد, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Allow me, I will stand, because if not, I do not see you, and it's very unpleasant to be talking to people that you do not see. Your Highness, dear friends, when I was coming to the university, I was asking myself, well, what am I going to talk about? And then all of a sudden, I decided that probably the best would be to confront you on one hand with what has just been said by our host, and which means we live in a world where more and more we have challenges that are global, more and more we have problems that no country can solve by itself, but at the same time a world where many people do not believe that international organizations can be helpful, that multilateralism can be helpful. They believe that their own countries should be doing it by themselves. As you said, nationalism, forms of xenophobia, forms of populism have been emerging. People are angry, do not trust their institutions, do not trust their governments, do not trust international organizations. And in this paradox, one can ask, but okay, but what is the role of the UN And is the UN doing anything, or is just a talk shop where people discuss lots of things, but in the end do very little to solve the problems of humankind? And so what I decided to do, if you agree, is to pick my 2 last weeks. And picking my 2 last weeks, try to show you what exactly the UN is trying to do to address the enormous challenges that we face. And those challenges are known. They have been repeated today. We are probably the central threat for humankind today is climate change. And everybody recognizes that climate change is running faster than what we are, and that this is a real risk of survival for our planet. On the other hand, we see a multiplication of conflicts and an enormous difficulty to solve those conflicts. And we see those conflicts more and more linked to a global threat, another global threat, which is terrorism. And terrorism spreading and becoming something unpredictable. It can strike anywhere at any time. No place is safe in relation to international terror today. There was always terrorism, but not this kind of global terrorism that now appears. On the other hand, it is obvious that we have people on the move. We have victims of conflict or of persecution that are refugees. We have people that simply can no longer live in their countries because drought, because there are no chances of employment, or because they aspire to a better life for them or their children and migrate in a context where, as we all know, most of this movement is today controlled by smugglers and traffickers that dramatically violate their human rights and generating situations of chaos that then have a very negative impact in public opinions that become themselves xenophobic against migrants, and create problems even in the political systems of their countries. Not to mention the fact that we are now facing the impact of new technologies from the use of the web that we all, to a certain extent, are now, I would say, relatively, we became slaves of it to a certain extent, but artificial intelligence and all the new developments that are taking place that will have a huge impact. There will be massive destruction of jobs, massive creation of jobs. At the same time, we are not prepared for that. It's clear that education, training, skills are absolutely vital, but it does no longer have any meaning to teach people to do things. What is necessary is to teach people to be able to learn permanently, because for the students that are here, very probably you will have jobs in the future that today do not simply exist and are not even imaginable. So the question is, all our educational systems is to adapt to this new reality in permanent change. But it is also obvious that facing these, we need to have adequate social safety nets. People will lose their jobs, but the jobs created will not be similar to the jobs that existed. We will need to have probably a new concept of work. A new relationship between work, leisure, and other occupations. So many things are challenging us, and we are not doing enough effort to prepare ourselves for these challenges. Now, in this context, as it was said, it is clear that countries cannot do it alone. It is clear that we need multilateral forms of governance. It is clear that we need to have international cooperation to address these questions. But we see more and more reluctance in many areas of the world to this approach. And more do it by ourselves. More and more, let's solve our problem and forget about the others. So, in this context, what are we doing? These 2 weeks. It started in Marrakesh. I don't know if you have heard about Marrakesh. In Marrakesh, we were able to approve a global compact on migration. Not all countries were there. Some do not believe in international cooperation. But when we see these movements of people around the world, with countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, it is obvious that no country alone can solve the problem. And you see people stranded at borders, suffering enormously. And we see situations that have created dramatic violations of human rights. And you see fortunes being made by smugglers, traffickers, everywhere. So it's clear we need international cooperation. But some are saying, no, we do it by ourselves. We close our doors and the problems will go somewhere else. They won't go somewhere else. There are no way to close the doors. If you close the door, people enter by the window. If you close the window, people dig a tunnel. There's no way. We need to have international cooperation. So what was extremely important in Marrakesh is that we came together, more than 150 countries, and we decided to cooperate on a number of things that seem obvious, but it's very difficult to implement. First, we need to offer opportunities for people where they live. So development cooperation policies, and there are billions that are used in development cooperation policies, sometimes they do not really care to make sure that conditions are created for people to have opportunities in their own villages, in their own cities, in their own communities. Sometimes development cooperation supports investments that uproot people. And when you are uprooted once, you become easily uprooted much more times. So we need to redesign all development cooperation policies in order to make sure that they help create opportunities for people to have a future in their own countries, and not only in their own countries, in their own regions, to avoid this kind of massive, chaotic urbanization that we are seeing in some parts of the world. Urbanization is inevitable, but it should be organized, it should be progressive and not chaotic, generating slums where people live in very miserable conditions and where, of course, people become the first candidates to migrate to other places. So we were able to redesign what development cooperation should be. But we also were able to agree that migration is necessary. And if migration is necessary, it's better to organize it. If people need to move, and we need them to move and to come, my country needs migrants, and Portugal is a relatively poor country, but I used that example in the meeting. My mother is 95 years old. We have a 24-hour system of support to her because of her health condition. I mean, I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of my mother. So we need migrants. Every country needs migrants, even those that say, no, we are against it. No, they need migrants. But if we need migrants, it's better then to organize this movement, to cooperate with countries of origin, to have legal opportunities for migration. And what we have agreed was, let's establish more legal opportunities for migration, and then let's cooperate much more in cracking down on traffickers and smugglers. If you look at today's world, there is a very effective international cooperation on cracking down on drug traffickers, but much less effective cooperation on cracking down on traffic of human beings. If I want to be cynical, I have an explanation for that. When I was in government, I never thought that my children would be trafficked, but I always thought that it would be victims of drugs. So probably all members of government everywhere in the world are more worried with the drugs than with the trafficking, because they believe that their children themselves will not be trafficked. The problem is that for the levels of poverty that exist, for the levels of discrimination that exist, many people are now victims of trafficking for the most horrible situations that you can imagine, and we are all aware of that. So cracking down effectively on smugglers and traffickers requires forms of cooperation of intelligence services, of police forces, of justice systems, much stronger than the ones that we have now. And these were the things we were trying to establish in Marrakesh. These were the things that we were trying to create as a compact, a voluntary compact, because in today's world it's very difficult to have everybody agreeing on mandatory things, but a voluntary compact bringing countries together to try to give a human face to migration, and at the same time to create conditions for countries of origin to benefit, and countries of destination also to benefit from an orderly, regular migration instead of this chaotic thing that we see sometimes in the screens of televisions that on the one hand show the suffering of people, on the other hand show that countries are not benefiting from the contribution of those people. And then after Marrakesh, I went to Stockholm, you might have heard about it, for the Yemen talks. And after many years, it was possible to have a first agreement. Now, why is the UN important in the context of these conflicts? For a very simple reason. There is such a level of mistrust among those that are involved in these conflicts that you need bridge builders, you need honest brokers, you need entities that have the legitimacy to be perceived as impartial. And it cannot be done by those that are involved in the conflict themselves or those that have interests related to those conflicts. It's very difficult to have a mediator that both sides will trust. And that's exactly the role of the UN. And I believe when I see what we are doing in Yemen, when I see what we are doing in Libya, when I see what we did in South Sudan, what we are doing in the DRC, what we are doing in so many other parts of the world, the UN has this legitimacy. Being the organization of all countries in the world, we are not here to serve East or West, South or North, this country or that country. We are here to offer a platform for those that fight each other to be able to sit together and having a referee that is impartial to establish new forms of solving their problems. And the truth is that it works. The truth is that we have seen many conflicts in the world being effectively mediated. And then the UN has also the capacity to organize through peacekeeping operations, through different forms of development cooperation or humanitarian aid. In Yemen, there is a gigantic humanitarian operation that is essentially led by the United Nations. So the combination of true mediating capacity, humanitarian aid, and coordination of development cooperation are things that the UN can do, and that countries by themselves, even if they can do, they have not the legitimacy that allows for them to be trusted to be able to do it. And then if you have noticed, I went 3 times in these 2 weeks to Katowice. In Katowice, we had a meeting called COP24. COP means Conference of Parties. They are the Conference of Parties in relation to the Climate Convention. And the objective of Katowice was to approve the work program of the Paris Agreement. Now, why was it so important, and why do we need the UN to do it? First, it was extremely important for a very simple reason. Climate change, as I mentioned in the beginning, is running much faster than what we are. We are seeing that all the scientific predictions, I know there's still some people that do not believe in science. I believe it's better to believe in science than to go to a witch or something of the sort to try to know what's going to happen. But even the scientific predictions that were made are to a certain extent proven wrong because things are getting worse than what was forecasted. We see glaciers melting much more quickly than before. We see the temperature of the water rising much more quickly than expected. Corals bleaching in many parts of the world. We see the Arctic, almost the ice cap of the Arctic being reduced at such a level that soon it will completely disappear in summer. For the first time I read this week that the glaciers, I think eastern, the south, eastern, sorry because I'm completely jet-lagged, the continent of the Antarctica, were for the first time melting and risking to separate. On the other hand, we see the multiplication of natural disasters that are more and more damaging with dramatic impacts and more frequent and with worse humanitarian consequences, and the Caribbean or the islands of the Pacific, or even recently in Florida, in Asia, in different parts of Asia, in India. So things are getting worse and worse and worse, and the political will is not going as fast as it was necessary. And the response is not being as fast as necessary. We are not reducing our emissions. On the contrary, we are still increasing the level of emissions in the last year. And the Paris Agreement was extremely important because for the first time, countries came together in a UN context and were able to accept a number of commitments, common commitments, to make sure that we wouldn't have an increase in temperature in the end of the century bigger than 1.5 to 2 degrees. And this commitment was made, and at the same time, countries engaged in a number of measures that they promised to do, but what we are seeing is that they are not yet doing it entirely, or many of them are not doing it entirely, and the way to regulate these, and the way to measure these, and the way to create monitoring mechanisms for these, and the way to be transparent in how this is done, and how the financial support for countries also to do it from those that have more capacity to those that lack capacity, for all these to be approved. I mean, it's like when we have in a country a constitution, then we need the laws to implement the constitution. Those laws to implement the Paris Agreement were the work program of the Paris Agreement that had to be approved in Katowice. And there was a risk not to reach an agreement. And the reason I went there 3 times was exactly to make sure that we could reach an agreement. And the funny thing is that the last difficult moment of the Katowice agreement was solved here in Qatar. There was a problem, I'm not going to mention the country, and it was here in Qatar. I met the minister of the country yesterday evening, and we agreed that indeed the problem had to be solved, and we had the solution for the problem. He contacted his president, the president contacted Katowice, and the problem was solved. Again, the role of the UN is to be an honest broker, is to be the kind of impartial element that can deal with developed countries and developing countries, with countries that are that have big emissions, and countries that are the main victims of climate change. There must be this role and an environment where they all can come together. That's the role of the UN. And as you have seen tonight, there was a success. People have agreed. And this will allow us now to be much more ambitious. I've convened a summit for September next year to bring together heads of state and government all over the world to make sure that the commitments that were made in Paris and need to be renewed in 2020 will be increased for us to be able to finally contain the impacts of climate change in relation to our societies. And so, I mean, for those that say, well, the UN is not necessary, we can do it by ourselves, the proof is that when we want to come together and address the more dramatic challenges that we face in peace and security, or in human rights of different natures, and the rights of migrants are part of human rights, or in addressing challenges like the ones that correspond to climate change, the UN is not only necessary, but with all its problems, with all its difficulties, it works. And it can work better. And that is why we are so strongly engaged in the process of reform to make it more effective, more nimble, more able to respond quickly to the challenges that we face, more able to provide a platform of action much more effective than the one that exists today. But contrary to what many people say, the fact is, with all its problems, with all its difficulties, multilateralism works. We are able to address problems, we are able to solve them, and in a chaotic situation in which there will be no rules, in which each one would fight for each one's interests, it is clear that for the powerful, it might be a solution. For the world, it would be a disaster.
Stand. So thank you, Your Excellency. I think this is very enlightening. I think it's very important for all of us to really also understand the effort that the UN put in trying really to tackle those very important problems and the role that it continues to do, and to learn about the reform, which is really also a very important notion. And I think now we would like to open the floor for some questions. And we would like maybe to give more opportunities to our students who are the future.
May I suggest that instead of asking questions, because more important for me than answer the questions of young people is to listen to their opinions. Okay. So I would be delighted if you could give me some advice. Tell me what you think. Tell me the things that we believe we are doing wrong and how you could do better. If you have any question, I will answer the question. But I'm very much more interested in learning with you what you think about these things.
Thank you. So, please.
السلام عليكم. شيخاني من موريتانيا. يمكن أتحدث بالعربية؟ أولا بما أننا نتحدث عن التعددية سأتحدث عن تعدد اللغات، خاصة أنه يحظى بأهمية عند الأمم المتحدة، واللغة العربية أصبحت منذ 6 أعوام ضمن اللغات ال6 في الأمم المتحدة. وهذا العام سيتم تخليده حول اللغة العربية والشباب. يعني وبما أن السيد الأمين العام مهتم بالشباب، ما هي رسالته للشباب فيما يخص الاهتمام باللغات واللغة العربية؟ من ناحية أخرى، بما أننا في قطر وبما أني موريتاني، وقطر في الحقيقة هذه قلتها عدة مرات لم تعامل الدول التي أخذت مواقف بالمثل، وهذه سنة حسنة تعتبر لها. ما هو دور الأمم المتحدة مستقبلا يعني تقوم بجهد حتى لا تتأثر الشعوب ببعض المواقف السياسية التي تأخذها الدول؟ وشكرا جزيلا للسيد الأمين العام ولكم جميعا على هذه الفرصة.
Well, that's one of the central aspects of the UN life. The UN is a multilingual organization. We have 6 official languages, French, English, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Mandarin, and Russian. And it is for me vital that we preserve different languages, all the languages, because a language is not just, I would say, okay, we can express our feelings in any language, it's all the same. No, a language is also linked to the way we think. A language is also linked to the way we live. And when we translate from one language to another, there is always something that is lost. The biggest example of that, and I mean, Arabic is a fantastic language for poetry. When you translate a poem, you write a new poem. You do not really translate your poem. You write a new poem. Languages are fundamental because they are the way in which we shape our own thinking. So to kill languages, to have everybody talking in this practical English I'm talking today, which is not exactly a language, is a very limited number of words, nothing compared with what a real English intellectual writing a nice book would write. It would be a much more sophisticated thing, but we have this practical English that everybody talks. The point is that lots of feelings, lots of emotions, lots of concepts are lost when we are not able to express them in our own language. So it is vital for me that we do everything possible to preserve multilingualism, to preserve cultural diversity, to recognize that cultural diversity is a richness. And this is another central question of the political debate in our societies. And allow me to move a little bit into that other thing, because I think everything is interrelated. All our societies will become multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural. It's inevitable. The idea of a homogeneous society with everybody more or less the same, forget about it. There might still be some examples, but they will disappear. Societies will be multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and diversity is a richness, it's not a threat. But for diversity to be a richness and not a threat, there must be a huge investment in social cohesion, cultural investment, economic investment, political investment, for each person to feel that their identity is valued, that they can express themselves in their language, that they can live their culture, but at the same time they all belong to the same community as a whole. And this is why language is so important. If we try to say, okay, if you all live in this country, you all have to speak the same language, and your own language doesn't matter anymore, it would be an enormous loss. To value language and multilingualism is a central question for the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for coming to Qatar. I'm an American student who is just finishing his time abroad studying here in the country. And my opinion for you is that I would like the United Nations to do more to address some of the sort of global forces that are shifting our economy, like globalization, automation. I know that there's been some advocacy by you for a universal basic income and other similar issues such as that. But I'm very concerned whether it's with the election of President Trump in my own country, with Brexit, with the yellow vest protests that we see in France. Across the world, there's this lack of a common, comprehensive idea as to how to transition our economy to adapt to these forces. And with all that in mind, I'd love to know your thoughts on how young people can get involved in this research and in public life and diplomacy more in general. Thank you.
Well, first, when you speak about some of the political phenomena that you have described, they are very much linked to the fact that with the evolution of globalization, it's not the only factor, of course, but evolution of globalization and technological progress, that of course, that combination created enormous wealth, created enormous prosperity in the world, dramatically decreased extreme poverty, dramatically increased life expectancy, decreased the number of children dying, etc. I mean, it's unquestionable that there is huge benefits. But like everything else in life, there are winners and losers. And there was people left behind. And this is about people, it's about regions, it's about sectors of the economy, in the rust belts of this world. And this has generated, together with the increase of inequality, has generated a lot of mistrust in political establishments that people believe do not care for them, mistrust in international organizations, even like the UN. And this is what is causing all these political new phenomena that we are witnessing in different parts of the world. Now, the only answer for this is to have a strong commitment, and this is what I believe the UN is trying to do with the so-called Agenda 2030, a strong commitment to convince people that globalization is not a bad in itself, but we need to accompany globalization with a strategy for sustainable and inclusive development. Sustainable in relation to the future, inclusive in relation to everybody in a society. We have this expression, leaving no one behind. Now, this is not easy, but we are working hard with that, and one of the most eminent advocates of the Sustainable Development Goals is Sheikh Hamad, that is here with us today. And trying to make countries understand the need to have development models that allow to incorporate everybody, incorporate them from the point of view of the benefits of growth, but also incorporate them from the point of view of the participation in the decisions that are taken. On the other hand, we are now coming into an era in which everything is becoming digital. And this digitalization of our societies is something that will have enormous impacts. And I'm not going to go along very much on that. But what is clear is young people have an absolutely crucial role, more than ever, in the evolution of our societies. Because the technology is evolving in such a way that my granddaughters understand it much better than me. And the contribution of young people to the drafting of policies and of solutions for the problems created by this huge and extremely quick technological evolution, the contribution of young people is absolutely essential. And that is why organizations like the UN need to be able, and this is one of the struggles we have, need to be able not only to communicate better with young people, but to be able to incorporate young people, their voices and their influence in our own decision-making processes. And this is true for societies and for governments. It's not possible today to rule a country and to prepare the future of that country if the decisions are made only by people that belong to the analogical world. No, we need to have people of the digital world together with people of the analogical world. The old people like me need to, in any case, to be on board. You're not going to kick me out so quickly. But we need everybody to be, and so the role of young people in shaping the decisions for the policies for the future is today absolutely essential. If governments are not able to have young people participating in the key decisions for the future of their countries will fail.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have a question. Is there any consideration that the list of countries with the power of the veto will be updated, or is that a static resolution? Considering that we're speaking about everybody, I feel there's a huge segment of population that are being left out. Thank you.
Well, we have a problem. The United Nations was created after the Second World War, and there are, several other bodies, but there are two central bodies, the General Assembly, where everybody has one vote, every country has one vote, and the Security Council, in which we have now 15, after the first extension, now 15, 5 permanent and 5 elected. And as you know, the 5 permanent members are the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. They have a veto right. Not on procedural matters, but on substantive matters. It means they cannot avoid that an issue is discussed, but they can veto a resolution on that issue. Well, today's world doesn't correspond to that. Today's world, if you look at the countries that are relevant in the global economy, today's world is different. Many countries were not independent when the Security Council was created. This is particularly true in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. So indeed, I have a deep belief that we would need a Security Council reform. There is a problem for the reform of the Security Council, is that the reform of the Security Council, there are things that can be done, and there are things that are being done, namely in relation to the transparency of procedures. For instance, if you look at my election, was different from any other election in the past. There was a competition, and there was a certain transparency in the methodology that was used, and this was new, which means there is some positive evolution that needs to be recognized. But the central question of composition and veto is more difficult, because to change it, you need 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, plus the vote of the 5 permanent members. So, power is a difficult thing to give. No? This is true in all kinds of situations. To give power to others is always very difficult. And so, it's not an easy thing to do to be able to create the conditions for this reform to be made. France and I believe the UK have made a proposal at a certain moment, which I found interesting, and that was to limit the veto right in some circumstances. For instance, in the case of genocide, there shouldn't be veto right, but that proposal was not accepted too. So this is a problem that we have. And you can imagine for a Secretary General, it's very complicated, because in some situations we are paralyzed, we are blocked, because in the Security Council there is no way to solve a problem. But for the people in general, it's the UN. No, that the UN that doesn't solve the problem. So they look at me as if I was the one that is not solving the problem. But that's life. I mean, it goes with the job. But it is one of the most difficult questions that we have. We have a decision-making system that is outdated. It is true.
السلام عليكم، نرحب بك سيدي الأمين العام. من عندنا
Just a moment.
أقدم نفسي فريد بن زغيوة، طالب كلية الدراسات الإسلامية، طالب في هذه الجامعة. نرحب بك أولا عندنا. في إطار حديثنا عن التعددية، أود أن أطرح عليك سؤال سيدي. هل صحيح أن الحضارات تتصارع فيما بينها، أم إن الصراع الحقيقي هو صراع بين الحضارات ومصالح الدول؟ وما موقف الأمم المتحدة من هذا الصراع؟ شكرا.
Well, the UN has the alliance of civilizations. We don't have the clash of civilizations. The clash of civilizations, I don't know if it was invented by Huntington, but I mean, it's in his book, but maybe someone else has invented it before. It is true that I don't like the name civilizations, because I think for that purpose it doesn't make much sense. Most of the conflicts, as you rightly said, are conflicts of interests, not of civilization, conflicts of interests that are between countries or between other economic interests. And usually, for instance, when you have a religious war, and we had in history many religious wars, most of the religious wars were result of political manipulation, which means the religion was not the reason of the war, was instrumentalized by politicians for their purposes, but they were not, the origin of it was a political, not a religious one. And so I am deeply committed to the idea that multicultural dimensions, multi-ethnic dimensions, multi-religious dimensions are essential. I'm deeply committed. We are revitalizing the Alliance of Civilizations. There is now a very distinguished Qatari diplomat that is in charge. We are very committed to revitalize the Alliance of Civilizations, where countries can come together and exactly fight against this idea that we are doomed to be in confront if some of us are Western and others are Eastern, or if some of us are really Christians and others are Muslims, or whatever. It's my deep belief that that diversity is a source of richness, and that behind what people call conflict of civilizations. What really exists is a conflict of interests and a conflict between either economic interests or political interests of different countries that use and manipulate culture and religion for all the purposes that we know. And this is true inside countries. When we see the manipulation done by politicians of migration, for instance, or of the cultural differences to gain votes based on xenophobic arguments. Again, the problem is not that there are different ethnic groups, the problem is that there are politicians that use it as an instrument to create fear, to create mistrust, and to gain votes based on fear and mistrust. It's much more difficult to gain votes based on good arguments, good solid arguments. It's much more easy to use fear, to use emotions, to try to gain easy votes, because to really present a good program and convince people that your ideas are good is much more complicated.
So we'll take one last comment or question.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, Your Excellency.
No excellencies.
Okay. It's an honor. My name is Suleiman.
You know that in the UN, if anyone says excellency in my office, there is a fine of $1,000.
Wow. Okay. Can I get a break this time? A
You
discount.
have a waiver, no.
Perfect. It's an honor to have you here, and I want to say I'm a Sierra Leonean American, born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and I grew up in the States, and now I'm here in Qatar. And just to kind of add to something that you said, just a few steps behind, when you said power is a difficult thing to give, I agree with you. But one thing that I've discovered here in Qatar is that Qatar believes in giving power to people, because the motto for Qatar Foundation is unlocking human potential. They gave me a scholarship and I came here to study, and now I work here, so they gave me power. And I believe that that's what we really do need to do with everybody around the world, regardless of where they come from. Just to kind of talk about, I think, a comment, I can only imagine what difficult position you're in as a Secretary General.
Could be easier.
It could be easier. But the thing is, I feel like the United Nations today is missing a bit of daring. And daring, thinking outside of the box. And when I say that, when we go back to World War II, for example, after World War II, the Berlin Airlift, I mean, that was a very ingenious idea of there was a famine going on, and okay, the only way we can get food to that place is by doing an airlift. And right now there's a famine going on in so many different places, and even not far away in Yemen, yet I feel like there's that daring missing. The other thing is that when you look at recently what happened in Thailand with the 16 kids that were stuck in the cave, the whole world thought about something outside of the box. It wasn't easy, but there was a daring and they took them out. The miners in Chile, the same exact thing. I feel like if the United Nations can just have a bit more daring to think outside of the box, we can solve a lot of problems. And basically that's my comment that I wanted to give. I know it might seem a bit naive because I don't see everything else that you see on your desk every day, but really that's something that we need to do today. And some of the best people to do the daring things are youth. So when you want to anchor something, you get somebody with much more experience, somebody who's older. But when you want to break through and really lead a change, that's when you need the youth. Jazakumullah khairan.
I think you are absolutely right, in the sense that all human organizations tend to do things based on their experience and based on they were doing things in the past. And one of the reasons of the reform is exactly to shake that in the UN. But I have to say that I recognize that our agencies, we have here UNICEF and UNDP, in relation to famine, for instance, the World Food Programme, our agencies have done a lot of important innovations. And one of the things is, indeed, when there is money, and without money it's difficult, but I have participated in airlifts of food in several situations. I remember one in South Sudan in which I was myself inside the plane. And lots of other things have been innovated. For instance, in the use of cash as an instrument instead of material goods. Traditionally, this idea that humanitarian action is to give blankets and shirts and food. And no, I mean, if conditions exist, now the UN is very strongly involved in providing support by cash, which empowers people. People will choose what, instead of receiving soya and milk, milk no, because milk is not very indicated in this, corn and oil or whatever. No, people receive cash that and they are able to make their choices. It's the empowerment. No, and this is exactly the way we are pursuing. I'll give you an example. UNHCR was distributing cash to families in Syria, in Jordan, with a system of eye recognition. The eye recognition that was made for their cards, their ID cards as refugees, was the same that was given to the banks, and people would go to without a card, without these cards that we have, the ATM cards, they would go to the bank, show their eyes to this system of recognition, and they immediately would have access to the cash that they are entitled to receive. Which means, we are able to innovate, to think out of the box, but it's true, much less than what we needed. And there is in any organization, and the worst in any organization is a trend to go on repeating things until we finally discover that there are much better ways to do things. There is an expression I usually use, not for this purpose, but for climate change, which is, it was not for lack of stones that the Stone Age ended. There were plenty of rocks. It's because people discovered other ways to do things. So the same applies here. We need to be able, independently of having the old mechanisms, to think out of the box and try to find solutions that are innovative. And technology today provides us with enormous instruments that allow us to be much more effective and even much more humane than in the past.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think there is a lot of interest in the crowd, but I don't think we can really take a lot of your time. Before we conclude, I'm just going to offer you a book that was really conducted by one of the faculty of the university in the law school, which is really on the new convention of the human rights of the UN, and he addressed it to you. Yes. So thank you, Your Highness, thank you, Your Excellency, thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Your Excellency, for a great